A knock at the door at 10 p.m., rain pouring down, and standing there, soaking wet, eyes swollen, was the last person Ethan ever expected to see. Not a stranger, not a friend, but the woman who had been a silent chapter in his life without him ever knowing it. What happens next will change everything he thought he knew about love, timing, and second chances. Let me introduce you to our new app, Allure TV. It's super simple to get started. You log in with Google or your email. In a few seconds you're in. This here is the home screen. Look how amazing it is. We feature dozens of intense, uncensored romance stories, organized by genre. We have mafia, billionaire, forbidden love, and contract romance themes. We have absolutely everything you could ever want. And the best part, no ads and no interruptions. Now look at this. Click here on the audio and start listening right away. You can even choose your preferred language. There's Portuguese, English, German, French. If you prefer to read, just click here on the ebook and that's it. The whole story appears for you to read at your own pace. And you can even interact. You are welcome to rate the story with stars and leave a comment. You can also add your favorite stories to a playlist and access them whenever you like. Do you like what you see? Go ahead and log in now. It is simple and free. You can find the link in the first pinned comment. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, the kind that didn't announce itself with thunder or drama. It simply arrived and stayed, soaking Portland's streets until the gutters ran like small rivers and the city lights blurred into watercolor smears against the dark. Ethan Hayes stood at his kitchen counter, a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand and a set of architectural blueprints spread across the marble surface, pretending to work. He wasn't working. He was doing what he'd become quietly expert at over the past 14 months, occupying space without truly inhabiting it. The knock came at 10:07 p.m., not urgent, not desperate. 3 soft taps, hesitant enough that he almost convinced himself he'd imagined them. He set down his glass, crossed the living room in the dark, and he hadn't bothered turning on more than the kitchen light, and opened the door. Claire Whitfield stood on his porch, completely drenched. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, her cream-colored jacket soaked through and clinging to her shoulders. She held no umbrella. She carried one bag, a canvas tote pressed against her chest like something she was protecting rather than simply carrying. Her eyes, when they met his, held the particular exhaustion of someone who had already cried and decided not to anymore. He knew her, of course. Vanessa's best friend. The quiet one at dinner parties who laughed at the right moments and never stayed too long. The woman he'd exchanged maybe 40 conversations with over 6 years of marriage, always at a careful, polite distance. Claire Whitfield, standing in the rain on his porch, looking like she'd walked a very long way to get here. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," she said, not as an apology, as a fact. Ethan didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside. She walked in slowly, leaving small puddles on the hardwood floor. He watched her take in the apartment, the sparse furniture, the blueprints on the counter, the single lamp casting a warm circle in the kitchen. The place had the quiet, careful look of a man who had stopped decorating because he wasn't sure he was staying. "I'll get you a towel," he said. "Thank you." He came back with 2, one for her hair, one for her shoulders, and set them on the arm of the couch without making her feel observed. She appreciated that. He could tell by the way her posture softened, just slightly, as she reached for them. "The guest room is made up," he offered. "It's not much, but it's dry." Claire looked at him then, really looked at him, with the kind of directness that most people reserved for moments of crisis or confession. "Ethan, why aren't you asking me what happened?" He considered that for a moment, leaning against the kitchen door frame with his arms loosely crossed. "Because you'll tell me when you're ready. And because whatever it is, it clearly wasn't your fault." He paused. "You don't knock on doors like someone who has something to apologize for." Something moved across her expression. Not quite relief, not quite surprise. Something quieter. She looked down at the towel in her hands. "I left Marcus," she said, 3 days ago. I've been staying at a hotel, but She stopped, started again. "I needed somewhere that didn't feel like I was just waiting to figure out what comes next." "You can stay here," he said, simply, without conditions attached. She looked up again. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. His voice was calm, the way people get calm when they've already survived the worst thing and fear has lost most of its leverage. The room's yours. There's extra coffee in the cabinet above the sink. I'm usually up by 6. Claire nodded slowly. Then, for the first time since she'd appeared on his doorstep, the tight line of her mouth softened into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was headed in that direction. You always were the steady one, she said almost to herself. Ethan said nothing, but as he turned back toward the kitchen, toward his blueprints and his cooling bourbon and his carefully maintained solitude, he felt something shift in the apartment's atmosphere, as if the walls had quietly exhaled. He didn't examine that feeling. Not yet. But the blueprints stayed unfinished on the counter all night. The first morning arrived quietly. Ethan woke at 5:58, 2 minutes before his alarm, the way he always did, as if his body had decided long ago that sleep was a courtesy it couldn't fully afford. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, cataloguing the sounds of the apartment the way he always did. The low hum of the refrigerator, rain still tapping against the window glass, the distant rhythm of early traffic on Burnside Street. And then, something different. The soft sound of movement in the kitchen, the careful, deliberate kind, made by someone trying not to wake anyone. He dressed without hurrying, pulled on a grey Henley and dark jeans, and walked down the hallway to find Claire standing at his stove in the oversized flannel shirt she'd apparently slept in, her hair loose and still slightly damp from the night before. She was making eggs. She'd found the good pan, the heavy cast-iron one he kept in the lower cabinet, and had already started coffee in the French press on the counter. She heard him come in and glanced over her shoulder. "I hope this is okay. I couldn't sleep, and I needed something to do with my hands." "It's more than okay," he said, and meant it. He sat at the kitchen island without being invited. It felt natural in a way he didn't analyze, and watched her navigate his kitchen with a careful respect for someone else's space. She didn't open drawers without asking. She kept things close to where she'd found them. There was something almost architectural about the way she moved, measured and deliberate, taking up exactly as much room as she needed, and not an inch more. She slid a plate in front of him. Eggs, sourdough toast, sliced tomatoes arranged without fuss. He noticed she'd used the sea salt from the back of the shelf, the good one he rarely remembered to reach for. "You cook like someone who actually pays attention," he said. Claire sat across from him with her own plate and wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I spent a lot of years cooking for someone who didn't notice. Eventually, you start doing it for yourself." She said it without bitterness, the way people say things they've already made peace with. Ethan looked at her over his coffee. "Marcus? Marcus?" She nodded once, and that was apparently all that needed to be said about that. They ate in a silence that was surprisingly easy, not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the kind that settles between people who don't feel the need to fill every moment with noise. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist, and Portland's grey morning light came through the kitchen window in that particular diffused way that made everything look slightly cinematic. 3 days passed in small rituals like that one. On the second morning, Ethan came home from a site visit to find a glass jar on the kitchen windowsill holding 3 stems of wildflowers, yellow and white, probably from the small florist 2 blocks over. No note, no explanation. They sat in the afternoon light like a quiet declaration that someone was paying attention to the space. He didn't mention them, but he moved the jar slightly so it caught the best light. On the third evening, Claire spread her freelance design work across the dining table, color palettes, brand mock-ups, her laptop open to 3 different screens, and worked with a focused intensity that he found, to his own quiet surprise, pleasant to be near. He sat across from her with his own blueprints, and they worked in parallel silence, occasionally exchanging observations that had nothing to do with the projects in front of them. "Do you think people can completely reinvent a space?" she asked at one point, studying a color swatch. "Or does a room always carry the memory of what it used to be?" Ethan looked up from his drawings. "I think spaces carry memory," he said slowly. "But the right changes can make the memory livable." Claire considered that, tilting her head slightly. That's either very wise or very sad. Maybe both, he said. She smiled at her laptop screen, and he looked back at his blueprints, and neither of them said anything more. But the apartment, which had felt hollow and grey for over a year, seemed, quote, in that moment, to be breathing again. It started with a second glass of wine. Not the first. The first was easy, almost ceremonial, poured after Claire finished a client call that had clearly gone sideways, and Ethan returned from a restoration project with plaster dust still on his forearms. They'd landed on the couch at roughly the same time, both carrying the particular exhaustion of people who push through difficult days without complaint, and the wine had appeared on the coffee table between them like a mutual agreement. The second glass was where honesty lives. Outside, Portland had finally surrendered the rain for a clear, cold night, and the city lights pressed softly against the living room windows. Ethan had put on something instrumental, low, unhurried guitar that asked nothing of the listener. The apartment felt smaller somehow in the good way, the way spaces contract when the people inside them stop being careful with each other. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, turning his glass slowly between his palms. Claire looked at him sideways from her end of the couch, legs tucked beneath her. "You've been sitting with that question for 20 minutes. You might as well." He almost smiled. "How did you never—" He paused, choosing words with the care of someone who'd learned that careless ones leave marks. "You're 34. You're not exactly someone who runs out of options. How did you never get married?" The question landed softly, but it landed. Claire looked at her wine for a moment, and he watched the small muscle in her jaw consider several answers before she chose one. "I got close," she said. "Twice. Once at 28, once at 31. She swirled the glass gently. "Both times I got to the part where you have to decide if you're choosing someone or just choosing not to be alone anymore. And both times I realized I was doing the second thing." She looked up. "That seemed like a terrible reason to promise someone forever." "That's more self-awareness than most people manage," Ethan said quietly. "Or more cowardice, depending on how you look at it." "I don't think those are the same thing." She studied him for a moment. "What about you? Do you actually believe the divorce was entirely Vanessa's fault, or is that just the version you've let yourself keep?" The question hit with the precision of someone who already knew the answer and was simply giving him room to say it out loud. Ethan was quiet for long enough that the guitar from the speaker filled the space between them. "No," he finally said. "It wasn't entirely her fault." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was present in the physical sense. I showed up. I paid attention to the house, the finances, the plans. But I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think I stopped asking her what she actually felt. And eventually she stopped telling me, and we just both kept showing up to a marriage that had quietly become a habit." Claire said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's one of the most honest things I've ever heard someone say about a relationship that ended. It took 14 months of expensive silence to get there." She laughed, and a real one, surprised out of her, and the sound of it did something unexpected to the air in the room. Ethan looked at her, and she looked back, and the moment stretched just slightly past comfortable. They both felt it. They both looked away at the same time, she toward the window, he toward his glass, with the synchronized precision of two people pretending they hadn't just crossed an invisible line. "I'm afraid of doing it again," he admitted, still looking at his wine. "Not the marriage part, the disappearing part. Becoming so careful and so routine that the person across from you stops feeling seen." He paused. "That terrifies me more than being alone." Claire turned back slowly. In the low light, her expression was open in a way he hadn't seen before, unguarded, almost tender. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "you seem like someone who sees people quite clearly." Ethan held her gaze for exactly one beat too long. Then he reached for the wine bottle. "Another?" he asked. "Please," she said. And neither of them mentioned the moment. But it stayed in the room with them, quiet and patient, like something that had decided it could wait. It built the way weather builds, gradually, imperceptibly, until one morning you step outside and realize the air has changed completely. Ethan noticed it first on a Tuesday. He'd been working at the dining table since early morning, his laptop open beside a sprawling set of restoration blueprints for a 1920s commercial building in the Pearl District. Coffee going cold beside him, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, entirely absorbed in the problem of a load-bearing wall that refused to cooperate with his client's vision. Claire had left for a coffee shop to work. She did that occasionally, reclaiming her own rhythms which he'd come to quietly respect, and the apartment had returned to its previous state of orderly silence. He didn't like it as much as he used to. That was the first thing he noticed. The silence, which had once felt like neutral ground, now felt like something was missing from it. He caught himself listening for the particular sound of her moving through the kitchen, or the way she hummed almost inaudibly when she was deep in a design problem, a soft, unconscious sound she probably didn't know she made. She came back mid-afternoon carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery on 11th. She set 1 cup beside his blueprints without interrupting him, left the bag between them, and settled at her end of the table with her laptop and her headphones around her neck like a person who understood the particular etiquette of shared working space. He looked up from his drawings. "You didn't have to—" "You had that look," she said, already opening her laptop. "The one where you've been staring at the same problem so long you've stopped seeing it. Caffeine helps." He picked up the cup. Their fingers didn't touch, but the deliberateness with which she'd placed it, close considered, registered somewhere beneath his ribs. "What look?" he asked. Claire glanced up with a faint smile. "Like the building personally offended you." He laughed and she returned to her screen, and they worked side by side for the next 2 hours in that easy parallel silence that had become one of his favorite parts of the day without him deciding it should be. The second moment came 3 days later. He was reviewing revised blueprints spread across the dining table, and Claire leaned in beside him to look at a detail he'd mentioned. Something about the original crown molding he was trying to preserve. She stood close, closer than necessary, her shoulder almost touching his as she studied the drawing. He could smell her perfume, something warm and understated, sandalwood and something lighter underneath it, and feel the slight warmth of her arm near his. "Here," he said, pointing to a section of the blueprint, and his hand brushed hers in passing. Neither of them moved immediately. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, his hand against hers, both of them looking at the same point on the paper, neither acknowledging what was happening in the periphery of that moment. Then she shifted slightly, and he straightened, and the conversation continued exactly where it had been, but his pulse hadn't quite returned to normal by the time she sat back down. The third moment was a Friday evening. They'd made dinner together, a loose, unplanned collaboration that had somehow resulted in pasta and a reasonable attempt at homemade focaccia, and were cleaning up in the kitchen, moving around each other with the practiced ease of 2 people who'd quietly memorized each other's patterns. She was laughing at something he'd said, and she turned from the sink at the same moment he reached past her for the dish towel, and they ended up closer than the kitchen required, her back nearly against the counter, his arms still extended, faces approximately 10 inches apart. The laughter faded into something quieter. Claire looked up at him. He looked down at her. The kitchen was warm and smelled like rosemary and olive oil and the particular domesticity of a shared evening, and for a suspended moment neither of them manufactured a reason to step back. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it. He straightened and reached past her for the towel he'd originally been after. "Sorry," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. "Don't be," she said quietly, and turned back to the sink. Ethan dried the same dish 3 times without realizing it. She didn't call first. That was the thing about Vanessa. She'd always treated advance notice as optional, as though the world naturally arranged itself around her arrivals. Ethan heard the sharp knock at 11 a.m. on a Saturday and knew before he reached the door. There was a particular cadence to the way she knocked, 3 rapid strikes with the knuckle, impatient and certain, that hadn't changed in the 6 years he'd known her. He opened the door and found her exactly as he remembered, impeccably dressed, a tailored burgundy coat, dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that had always taken significant effort. She was beautiful in the sharp, declarative way she'd always been beautiful, and she was furious. Her eyes moved past him immediately, scanning the apartment with the swift efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. "Is she here?" Vanessa asked. "Good morning to you too," Ethan said. She stepped inside without being invited, also unchanged, and Claire appeared from the hallway at precisely the wrong moment, coffee mug in hand, wearing a cream knit sweater and dark trousers, her hair down. The scene assembled itself into something that looked, from a certain angle, quite different from what it was. Vanessa's expression shifted from fury to something colder. "How long?" she said. The question was directed at Claire, but the accusation was aimed everywhere. Claire set her mug down slowly on the counter. "Vanessa, how long have you been here?" The voice was controlled now, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Because I find it fascinating, truly fascinating, that the week after I mentioned to a mutual friend that Ethan bought the house on Sycamore, you suddenly have nowhere to go." "That's not what happened," Claire said. "Isn't it?" Vanessa turned fully toward her, and the warmth she'd once performed at dinner parties was completely absent now. "You always wanted this. Don't stand in his kitchen in your little sweater, pretending you didn't orchestrate every moment of this." The word orchestrate landed like something thrown. Ethan stepped forward. "Vanessa, enough." "No." She held up one hand without looking at him, eyes fixed on Claire. 11 years. 11 years I kept you close, introduced you to everyone I knew, defended you when people said you were too quiet, too strange, too—" She stopped, recalibrating. "And the entire time you were just waiting, weren't you? Just quietly waiting for your opportunity." The room held its breath. Claire stood very still, the kind of still that isn't passivity but something closer to its opposite, a person gathering every scattered piece of themselves into one place before speaking. Ethan watched her and said nothing, instinctively understanding that this moment wasn't his to manage. When Claire spoke, her voice was low and remarkably steady. "You want to talk about 11 years, she said. "Then let's talk about them honestly." She took a step forward, not aggressive but grounded. "For 11 years I rearranged my schedule when you needed company and disappeared when you didn't. I listened to every version of every crisis without once making it about myself. I sat at your dinner table and made conversation with your husband and your colleagues, and every person you decided mattered that season." She paused. "And not once did you ask me how I was doing and actually wait for the answer." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "I came here because I left a relationship that was making me disappear," Claire continued. "I came here because Ethan opened the door. That's the whole story. I'm sorry if it's less dramatic than what you've constructed." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something irreversible having been said. Vanessa looked at Ethan then, for the first time since her arrival, with something complicated and briefly unguarded in her expression. Not quite regret, not quite grief, but something in that neighborhood. "You always did prefer the quiet ones," she said finally, quietly. Then she picked up her bag, turned and walked out. The door closed behind her with a clean, definitive click. Ethan stood in the middle of his living room looking at Claire. She was staring at the closed door, chest rising and falling with controlled breath, fingers wrapped around her own elbows like she was holding herself together from the outside. "Claire!" She turned. Her eyes were dry but luminous, the look of someone who has just survived something they'd been dreading for years and discovered it was survivable. He crossed the room and, without deliberating, put his arms around her. She leaned into it, not collapsing but landing, her forehead dropping to his shoulder with a quiet exhale that carried the weight of 11 years in it. He held her without speaking, and standing there in the late morning light, with the city moving indifferently outside his windows, Ethan understood something with a clarity that required no analysis. Claire Whitfield had just shown him exactly who she was, and he couldn't remember the last time someone had done that. The days after Vanessa's visit settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the easy silence they'd built together over 3 weeks, the comfortable, breathing kind that filled the apartment like warm air. This was something more careful, more deliberate. The kind of quiet that two people construct when they're both aware that something has shifted and neither is quite ready to name it. Claire was the one who pulled back first. It happened gradually enough that Ethan almost convinced himself he was imagining it. She started leaving earlier in the mornings, laptop bag over her shoulder, coffee in a travel mug, a brief smile at the door that was perfectly pleasant and revealed absolutely nothing. She mentioned a temporary design contract with a firm in the Pearl District, 3 weeks of work that required long hours and focus. He said that was great. She said it was good timing. They were both telling the truth, and somehow it still felt like a negotiation. The dinners they'd fallen into making together became solitary again. He'd come home to find a covered plate in the fridge with a post-it note, "Didn't know when you'd be back. Help yourself," written in her precise architectural handwriting. He ate alone at the kitchen island and told himself this was normal. People had their own lives. Shared spaces didn't require synchronized schedules. But he noticed. He noticed everything. He noticed that she'd moved her design books from the dining table back to her room, that the wildflowers in the kitchen windowsill weren't replaced when they wilted, that she knocked on the bathroom door now before entering the hallway, as if recalibrating the physical boundaries of the space they shared, pulling back the small intimacies of cohabitation one by one. On Thursday, he stayed late at the office reviewing contractor bids and came home to find the apartment dark except for the light under her bedroom door. On Friday, she was already asleep by the time he finished a client call at 10. On Saturday, she spent most of the day at a coffee shop and came home smelling like espresso and cold air, said goodnight with her hand already on the hallway wall, and disappeared. He didn't push. He understood the impulse. He'd done the same thing after the divorce, contracting inward like a building bracing for weather. But understanding something intellectually and feeling it are different experiences entirely, and what he felt was something uncomfortably close to loss. The moment of clarity came on a Wednesday, just past 3 in the morning. Ethan had woken without knowing why, that sudden, alert consciousness that bypasses confusion and arrives fully assembled. He lay still for a moment, then gave up on sleep and walked to the kitchen for water. The hallway was dark, but as he passed the living room, he saw her. Claire was standing at the large window, arms crossed loosely over her chest, looking out at the city. She'd pulled on a grey oversized sweatshirt and soft trousers, her hair loose, feet bare on the hardwood floor. The city lights painted her in soft amber and silver, and she was so still she might have been part of the architecture. Ethan stopped. He should have said something, announced himself, retreated quietly, offered tea. Instead, he stood in the hallway threshold for a moment, watching her watch the city, and felt the full weight of everything neither of them had said press against the inside of his chest like a held breath. She heard him. She turned, and for a moment surprise crossed her face before she composed it. "Sorry," she said softly. "I didn't hear you. Don't apologize." He walked into the living room and stood beside her at the window, close but not touching, both of them looking out at Portland's quiet 3 a.m. geometry, the bridges lit against the river, the distant red pulse of a cell tower, the slow drift of fog between the buildings. They stood like that in silence for what might have been 2 minutes or 10. "Claire." His voice was low, unhurried. "Ethan." A warning in hers, gentle but present. "I'm not going to say anything you're not ready to hear," he said, "but I need you to know that whatever this is—" He gestured slightly, meaning the distance, the careful smiles, the retreating inches. "You don't have to do it. Not here." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a lone car moved along the wet street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling before disappearing. "I know," she finally said. So quietly he nearly missed it. She didn't turn toward him. He didn't reach for her. They stood side by side at the window in the 3 a.m. dark, shoulder almost touching shoulder, the city spread out before them like a map of everywhere they hadn't yet decided to go. And between them, patient and unresolved, something waited. It was a Sunday when she finally told him. Not planned. Nothing between them ever seemed to follow intention. It started with rain again because Portland in November apparently had no other setting, and a slow morning that neither of them rushed to fill. Ethan had made pancakes, a rare, deliberate act of Sunday domesticity, and Claire had appeared from her room looking genuinely surprised, like someone who'd forgotten that mornings could be unhurried. They'd eaten at the kitchen island, trading sections of the same online newspaper on their respective phones, occasionally reading sentences aloud to each other with no particular agenda. The 3 a.m. window moment from 4 nights ago sat between them, not awkwardly but present, the way important things remain present even when nobody's looking directly at them. It was the second cup of coffee when Claire set her mug down with a small, deliberate precision and said, "There's something I need to tell you." Ethan looked up. Her expression was the particular combination of resolve and vulnerability that people wear when they've rehearsed something many times and are now abandoning the script entirely. "Okay," he said simply. She turned her mug slowly in her hands. 7 years ago, before Vanessa, before any of this, I was at a book fair in Seattle, the kind that takes over a convention center for a weekend, hundreds of tables, that particular smell of new paper and old coffee. She paused. "You were there." He was quiet, watching her. "You were standing at a table near the back, holding a book on mid-century architectural photography. You were laughing at something the vendor said. I never heard what it was. And then you said—" She stopped, took a breath. "You said the best buildings are the ones that look like they've always been there, like the street grew up around them rather than the other way. You were talking about a photograph. You weren't talking to me." Ethan said nothing. He had no memory of this. He was certain of that, and the certainty felt strange, almost disorienting, like being told about a version of yourself that existed without your knowledge. "I didn't speak to you," Claire continued. "You moved on to the next table. I bought the book you'd been holding because it seemed like the only logical thing to do." A short, self-aware breath of a laugh. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds human," he said carefully. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at her mug. "When Vanessa introduced us 18 months later, I recognized you immediately, and I had approximately 4 seconds to decide what to do with that." She pressed her lips together. "I chose to say nothing, because Vanessa was in love with you and she was my closest friend. And what was I supposed to say? Actually, I've been thinking about a stranger I met at a book fair for a year and a half." "So you just—" "I tucked it away," she said. "The way you tuck things away when keeping them would cost someone else something. I convinced myself it was nothing. Proximity bias, some romantic projection I'd built around a 30-second encounter." She exhaled. "And mostly, I believed that, right up until I didn't." The kitchen held the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Ethan turned his coffee cup slowly on the counter. He was processing not with shock, but with something more complex, the odd, weightless feeling of understanding. Suddenly that a thread you hadn't known existed had been running through events you thought you understood. "The night you knocked," he said slowly. "Was that desperation and courage in roughly equal measure?" she said. "I genuinely had nowhere to go." That part was completely true. She looked at him directly now, and her eyes were steady, clear, asking for nothing. "But when I was standing outside in the rain trying to decide which door to knock on, yours was the only one that felt honest." Ethan looked at her for a long, unguarded moment. "I'm sorry I don't remember Seattle," he said. Something softened at the corners of her mouth. "You weren't supposed to. That's sort of the whole story." He reached across the kitchen island then, unhurried, deliberate, and covered her hand with his. Not urgently, the way you touch something you intend to be careful with. "I'm glad you knocked," he said. Claire looked down at his hand over hers. When she looked up, the careful composure she'd been maintaining for weeks had finally quietly come undone. Not into tears, but into something more exposed than that. Something true. Outside, the rain continued its steady, patient conversation with the city. And inside, 2 people sat in a Sunday kitchen. 7 years of silence finally exhaled between them, figuring out, slowly, without rushing, what came next. The hand stayed on the counter long after the coffee went cold. Neither of them moved to reclaim it, his hand over hers, warm and still, like something that had finally found the right place after looking for a long time. The rain against the windows had softened to a murmur, and the kitchen held that particular Sunday stillness where the world outside feels temporarily suspended, as though it agreed, for once, not to interrupt. It was Claire who eventually moved, not away but slightly, turning her hand beneath his so that her fingers curled loosely around his palm. A quiet response, an acknowledgement, without a declaration. Ethan looked down at their hands and then up at her. "I don't want to get this wrong," he said, not with fear in his voice, but with the careful honesty of someone who has already paid the tuition on carelessness. "Neither do I," Claire said. "Which is why I think we need to talk about what this actually is before either of us decides what to do about it." He appreciated that about her, the refusal to let important things drift into comfortable ambiguity. He'd spent 6 years in a marriage that had survived almost entirely on comfortable ambiguity, and he understood now what it cost. "All right," he said. "Then tell me what it is, from your side." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing toward an answer just to fill the silence. Outside, a bicycle moved along the wet street below, its rider unhurried in the rain. "I think," she said slowly, "that somewhere in the last few weeks I stopped being someone who was staying here temporarily and started being someone who was—" She paused. "Present. Actually present. In a way I haven't been anywhere in a very long time." "Because of the place?" he asked. "Or because of who's in it?" Her eyes found his. "You already know the answer to that." He did. He'd known it since the Friday evening in the kitchen with the rosemary and the olive oil and 10 inches of charged air between them. He'd known it, if he was being genuinely honest, since the morning she'd navigated his kitchen with that careful, attentive grace and left wildflowers on the windowsill without making it a gesture. "I'm afraid of the Vanessa of it all," he admitted. "Not because I still have feelings for her, I don't. That's been over far longer than the divorce made it official. But because this—" He gestured between them with his free hand. "It's complicated in ways that don't simplify just because we want them to." "I know," Claire said. "I've thought about that too." She turned slightly on her stool to face him more directly. "But I've also spent a significant portion of my adult life letting complexity be a reason not to feel things. And I'm 34 years old and I'm tired of that particular habit." Something in his chest loosened at that. A tightness he'd been carrying so long, he'd stopped recognizing it as a tightness and had simply absorbed it as his natural resting state. He reached up with his free hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, slowly with the full awareness of what he was doing, and left his fingers briefly at her jaw, just resting there, and watched something in her expression open like a room with the windows finally unlocked. Claire. Her name in his mouth felt different than it had 30 days ago, more weight to it, more intention. "I know," she said softly, as if she'd heard the whole sentence. He leaned forward and kissed her, unhurried, without drama, the way certain things happen when they've been building long enough that the moment arrives less like an event and more like an exhale. Her hand came up to his chest, not pushing away but simply resting there, feeling his heartbeat the way you check that something is real. When they separated, neither of them spoke immediately. Claire rested her forehead briefly against his, eyes closed, breathing him in. Sandalwood soap and coffee, and the particular warmth of someone you've decided to trust. "So what happens now?" she murmured. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her properly. "Now," he said, "I think you stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go." He held her gaze. "Because you choose to." The word choose landed differently than stay would have. She heard the distinction immediately. He could see it in the way her expression shifted, something releasing that had been braced for a long time. "I have conditions," she said after a moment, and the slight return of her composure was so characteristically her that he almost smiled. "I would expect nothing less," he said. And outside, the rain made its patient case against the windows, and the city went about its Sunday business, and inside a kitchen on Sycamore Street, 2 people sat close together, figuring out, carefully, honestly, without rushing, what choosing each other actually looked like. The answer, it turned out, was going to require some construction. The conditions, as it turned out, were 3. Claire laid them out the following evening over dinner, not nervously, not with apology, but with the measured clarity of someone who had spent considerable time understanding the difference between compromise and self-erasure. She sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table, with a glass of red wine and the particular posture of a person who had decided, perhaps for the first time in a long while, to ask for exactly what she needed. "First," she said, "I want my own income. Not because I don't trust you, but because I've watched what happens to people who let their financial independence become someone else's generosity. It changes the geometry of everything." Ethan nodded. "That's not a condition, that's just sense." She allowed a small smile. "Second, I want my own space, not distance from you. Space that's entirely mine. Somewhere I can close a door and exist without negotiating it with anyone." "Also reasonable," he said. "Third," she paused here, turning her wineglass slowly between her fingers, "I need this to be chosen every day, not assumed, not convenient." Her eyes met his directly. "I've done convenient before. I know what it feels like from the inside, and it feels like slow disappearing. If this is real, it chooses itself forward, not because we're already here, but because we keep deciding to be." The kitchen held the weight of that for a moment. Ethan looked at her across the table, this woman who had knocked on his door with one bag and 7 years of quiet honesty, and felt something settle in him with the particular solidity of a load-bearing wall finally positioned correctly. "I can work with those conditions," he said. "I know you can," she replied. "That's why I told you." What happened next surprised even him. 3 days later, Ethan was walking the block behind his building, a habit he'd developed during the divorce, urban wandering as a form of thinking, when he noticed the house next door had a for sale sign that hadn't been there the previous week. A narrow craftsman, slightly neglected, with good bones and a south-facing garden that received extraordinary afternoon light. He stood on the sidewalk for longer than was probably normal for a man simply passing by. He called his realtor before he reached the corner. The purchase took 11 days. The decision to restore it himself took approximately 11 seconds. He drew the renovation plans at his own dining table over 2 evenings, working with the focused satisfaction of a man solving a problem that genuinely interested him, opening walls thoughtfully, preserving the original fir floors, designing a studio space on the upper level with north-facing skylights that would make any designer's natural light requirements entirely unnecessary. He didn't tell Claire immediately. He wanted it to be real before it was a conversation. When he finally showed her, walking her around the exterior on a cold December afternoon, her breath visible in the air, her expression moving carefully from confusion to understanding, she stood very still on the back garden path and looked at the shared fence line between the two properties. "Ethan." Her voice was quiet. "There'd be a passage," he said, pointing to a section of the garden hedge, small, discreet. "You'd have your own entrance, your own address, your own everything." He paused. "And a door between the gardens that's entirely your choice whether to open." Claire stood looking at the space for a long moment. The afternoon light came across the rooftop at a low angle, casting long shadows across the frost-pale grass, and somewhere above them a crow made its unhurried commentary on the proceedings. "You built me a life," she said softly, not accusatory, almost wondering. "I built you a door," he corrected gently. "What's on your side of it is entirely yours." She turned to look at him then, and her expression carried something he hadn't seen on her face before. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but the particular luminous quality of a person who has been seen so completely and so carefully that they no longer feel the need to make themselves smaller. She crossed the frozen garden path and put her arms around him, her face against his neck, holding on with the quiet certainty of someone who has finally, after a very long search, found the right place to land. He held her in the cold afternoon air, his chin resting against her hair, both of them looking out at 2 houses and the small, significant space between them. Some things, he thought, are built not to keep people in, but to give them somewhere worthy of choosing to return to. Some people enter our lives loudly, demanding to be noticed. Others wait quietly for years, patient, steady, certain, until the moment finally arrives when courage and timing align, and they raise their hand and knock. Claire didn't take Ethan's house. She built her own, right beside it. And isn't that exactly what real love looks like? Not 2 people becoming one, but 2 whole lives choosing every single day to share the same horizon. If this story moved you, Leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your messages genuinely mean everything. And if you want more, deeper, more intense, no interruptions, the link is in the first pinned comment. Trust me, inside it's a whole different level.